1915, three men stood inside a tree, not next to it, not leaning against it, but standing fully inside the hollow of its stump as if it were a room. The opening was wide enough to swallow them, and they looked small in a way that doesn't make sense unless you've seen the image yourself. It doesn't feel like a tree. It feels like architecture, something built rather than grown. And that's where the problem begins. Because that tree didn't fall in a storm, and it didn't collapse over time, it was cut down, deliberately processed, and turned into railroad ties and lumber within a matter of hours. A living organism that had stood for longer than entire civilizations was reduced to material in a single workday. No ceremony, no documentation beyond routine logging records, no recognition that anything unusual had just been removed from the world. And somehow that part feels normal to us, but it shouldn't, because that tree was not an exception, and that stump was not rare. It was part of a landscape that no longer exists in any meaningful way. There was a time when entire coastlines were covered in forests of trees so large that what we now call big would have been considered insignificant. Not scattered giants, not isolated anomalies, but continuous systems made up of organisms that reached heights most people today will never physically experience. And here's the part that most people never stop to consider. You have never stood in a forest like that. You have never looked up and seen a canopy so high that light doesn't behave normally, and you have never heard the sound of wind moving through something that large. You don't have a reference point for it, not in your memory, not in your experience, not even in modern environments. What you think of as a forest today is not what a forest used to be, and the difference between those two things is much larger than most people are comfortable acknowledging, because what used to exist is gone, not gradually, not over thousands of years, but within a window so short that the people who removed it were still alive to describe it. Within a few decades, landscapes that had taken millennia to form were stripped, processed, and replaced with something smaller, simpler, and easier to manage. And it happened so quickly that almost no one alive today has any direct sensory memory of what was there before, which creates a very specific kind of blindness. If you've never experienced something, you don't notice when it's missing. And if you don't notice when it's missing, you don't ask questions about how or why it disappeared. You accept the current version of reality as the baseline, and anything outside of it starts to feel exaggerated or impossible. That's how something extraordinary becomes invisible, not because it's hidden, but because it no longer fits inside what people expect the world to look like. But the evidence didn't disappear. It's still there in photographs, in stumps that remain embedded in the ground, in accounts written by the men who cut those trees down. They describe things that don't read like normal logging work, the smell of freshly cut wood that they couldn't compare to anything familiar, the ground shaking when a large tree fell, the way light filtered through the canopy in a way that felt unnatural. They weren't describing raw material, they were describing an environment that behaved differently from anything most of us have ever seen. And then they kept cutting, not because they didn't understand what they were inside, but because the system they were part of didn't give them a reason to stop. The trees weren't framed as something to preserve, they were framed as something to process. And once something is defined that way, its scale stops mattering. A 300-foot tree becomes boards, beams, and ties broken down into units that can be moved, sold, and used without forcing anyone to confront what it used to be. That transformation is the key, because once something is reduced into pieces, it stops feeling significant, and once it stops feeling significant, it becomes easy to remove the rest of it without hesitation. The forest wasn't destroyed all at once. It was converted piece by piece, and each piece looked small enough to justify the next. By the time the process was complete, what had been removed no longer existed as something recognizable only as materials distributed across cities, railroads, and infrastructure that still exist today. And that leads to a question that most people don't ask because it doesn't fit comfortably inside the way this story is usually told. If something that large could disappear that quickly without resistance, without interruption, and without leaving behind a shared memory of what it actually was, then what exactly made that possible? Because it wasn't just tools and it wasn't just demand, it was something deeper than that, something structural, a system that could take something ancient, something massive, something irreplaceable, and treat it as if it were temporary, as if it were always meant to be removed. And once you see that the photograph stops being a curiosity, it becomes a clue. Because those three men standing inside that stump aren't just showing you how big the tree was, they're showing you how small the frame of reference has become. They are standing inside something that no longer exists in the world, and the only reason it doesn't feel impossible is because it's already gone. And the question that follows is much harder to ignore than the image itself. If we could remove something that large without fully understanding what it was, then what else might we already be in the process of removing right now without realizing it until it's too late? If those trees were that large, then the real question isn't just why they were cut, it's how something that massive could be removed so quickly without slowing the system down. Because cutting a single tree over 300 feet tall is already difficult, but removing entire forests of them within a few decades requires more than effort. It requires infrastructure coordination and a system that was ready to operate at scale the moment it began. And by the late 1800s, that system was already in place. By the end of the 19th century, more than 100 sawmills were operating along the northern California coast, alone, each one running continuously and demanding a constant supply of timber. These mills didn't wait for trees. Trees were brought to them in a steady flow, day after day, year after year. That means entire sections of forest were being cut in sequence, not randomly, but in a pattern that matched transport routes and processing capacity. What looks like isolated logging quickly becomes something else when you realize how much material had to move just to keep those mills running. The tools were built for size. Crosscut saws stretched over 10 feet long, designed to slice through trunks that could exceed 20 feet in diameter, while loggers stood on springboards embedded into the trees several feet above the ground. That detail alone tells you something important. The process wasn't improvised, it was adapted to trees far larger than what most people consider normal. They weren't figuring it out as they went, they were repeating a method that already worked. And once the tree fell, the real system took over. A single redwood trunk could weigh over 100 tons, far beyond what animals could realistically move, which is why steam-powered logging systems became standard. Cable lines stretched across the forest, pulling entire trunks over long distances, dragging them down slopes and across uneven ground with controlled force. These weren't occasional tools, they were deployed across entire regions, operating continuously to keep timber moving without interruption. Then came the rail lines. By the early 1900s, thousands of miles of temporary logging railroads had been laid into forests across the Pacific Northwest, built specifically to move timber out as fast as it was cut. These tracks didn't connect cities. They followed the trees, extending deeper into untouched areas and then disappearing once the section was cleared. The system didn't stay still. It advanced, pushing forward in stages until there was nothing left ahead of it. And that's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Between the mid-1800s and early 1900s, old-growth redwood forests were reduced from millions of acres to a small fraction of their original size, not over centuries, but within roughly 60 years. That kind of transformation doesn't happen without resistance unless something is designed to keep it moving. Forest after forest, grove after grove, the process repeats with a consistency that doesn't feel accidental. But the most important shift happens after the trees are gone. Because once a 300-foot tree is cut, it doesn't stay a tree, it becomes lumber. It becomes boards, beams, railroad ties, standardized pieces that can be counted and stacked without any sense of what they used to be. The scale disappears the moment it's divided, and once the scale disappears, so does the feeling that anything extraordinary was ever there. That's how the system sustains itself, not by hiding what it's doing, but by changing how it's seen. You don't need to convince people to destroy something irreplaceable if you can make it look replaceable. A forest becomes inventory, and inventory can always be used, always justified, always replaced by the next supply. You can see that same logic in the towns built around the forests. Entire communities appeared in areas where logging was active, supporting hundreds of workers, only to disappear within a decade once the surrounding timber was gone. Foundations remain in parts of Oregon and California, marking places where full populations once existed, temporarily tied directly to the extraction process. These weren't permanent settlements. They were extensions of the system built to operate and then abandoned when their purpose was complete. And once you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The forest supports the system removes the forest, and then it moves on, repeating the same process somewhere else. It doesn't stop, it doesn't adapt. It simply continues as long as there is something left to take. And because each step looks smaller than the whole, the scale of what's happening never fully registers. But here's the part that matters most. The same system that could calculate the value of timber down to the last board had no way to measure what those forests were doing while they were still standing. It could price wood transport labor and output, but it could not account for the environment those trees created, the systems they supported, or the processes that had been running long before anyone started cutting, which means something very specific. The system was incredibly efficient at removing the forest, but completely incapable of understanding it. And once you see that, the story changes again. Because if something that large could be removed before anyone fully understood what it was, then the real question is no longer how it happened. The real question is what was operating inside those forests that we never had the chance to observe, and what might we still be overlooking right now because the systems we rely on cannot recognize it until it's already gone. At this point, it's easy to think the story is about trees, about size, about industry, about how something massive was removed too quickly. But that's not actually what makes this difficult to sit with, because the trees themselves were only the visible part of the system, and when they disappeared, something else went with them that most people never stop to consider. The forest wasn't just a collection of large objects, it was a functioning environment, a system that had been operating continuously for thousands of years. The canopy controlled light, temperature, and moisture in ways that don't exist in younger forests. The soil beneath it wasn't just dirt, it was a layered network of roots, fungi, and microorganisms connected across entire regions. What looked like individual trees were actually part of something much larger, something that only works when it remains intact. And that's the part we never observed directly, because by the time science had the tools to study ecosystems at that level, most of the original system was already gone. What we know today comes from fragments, isolated patches, second-growth forests, and reconstructions based on limited data. We don't have a full reference for what a complete old-growth system of that scale actually did while it was still operating, which means we're working backwards, trying to understand something after it has already been dismantled, using pieces that no longer behave the way the original system did. And that creates a gap not just in the environment, but in knowledge, because you can't fully reconstruct a system you never had the chance to observe in its complete form. What we do know is enough to make the loss feel different. Old growth forests store massive amounts of carbon, regulate water cycles, and create microclimates that influence entire regions. They capture fog-hold moisture in the soil and stabilize ecosystems in ways that younger forests simply cannot replicate. These aren't small differences. They are structural functions, things that only emerge when a system has been allowed to operate without interruption for centuries. And once that system is broken, it doesn't come back. You can plant trees, you can protect land, you can wait decades or even centuries, but you cannot recreate thousands of years of continuous growth within any time frame that matters to human life. The second growth forests that exist today may look large, but they are not the same system and they are not performing the same functions. They are replacements, not continuations. That's where the idea of a ghost begins to make sense. Because what remains isn't empty, it's altered, shaped by something that used to be there, but no longer exists in its original form. The soil still carries traces of what once supported those trees, and the environment still reflects patterns that were established long before the forest was cut. But the system itself, the full version of it, is gone, and that changes how you should look at those stumps. They're not just remnants of large trees. They are markers of a system that no longer exists, physical evidence that something operated at a scale we no longer experience. They don't just show you how big the trees were, they show you that what was there before is not what's there now, which leads to a question that becomes harder to ignore the longer you sit with it. If an entire system of that size could disappear before we understood what it was doing, then what exactly did we lose access to when those forests were removed? Not just the trees, but the processes, the interactions, the functions that were never fully observed or measured. Because once something like that is gone, you don't just lose the thing itself, you lose the ability to even recognize it if it were happening again. And that's where this stops being a story about the past. Because if the systems we rely on today are still limited to measuring what can be converted, what can be priced, what can be broken into parts, then we may still be looking at complex systems the same way those forests were once seen, not as something to understand, but as something to process. And if that's true, then the most important part of this story isn't what happened 100 years ago. It's what might already be happening now in ways that feel normal, routine, and invisible until the moment they're gone, and all that's left is a photograph, a fragment, or a question we no longer know how to answer. By now, the story should feel different from how it started, because what looked like a simple photograph has turned into something much harder to ignore. 3 men standing inside a tree is no longer just an image. It's a reference point, a reminder that the world we see today is not the world that was here before. And once that shift happens, it becomes difficult to look at anything the same way again, because the trees are gone, but the pattern remains. A system that can only recognize value once something is cut, divided, and converted will always move in the same direction. It doesn't matter what the object is, whether it's a forest, a resource, or something more complex, the outcome is predictable. If it cannot be measured while it exists, it will only be understood after it's been removed. And that's the part that should make you uncomfortable, because it means the disappearance of those forests wasn't an isolated event, it was a demonstration of what happens when a system is capable of acting faster than it is capable of understanding. The cutting wasn't the anomaly, it was the result, the visible outcome of something deeper that was already in place long before the first tree fell. That's why the stumps matter, not because of their size, but because of what they represent: a boundary between 2 versions of reality. On one side, a system that operated for thousands of years without interruption, shaping everything around it. On the other, a system that replaced it in less than a century and moved on without fully accounting for what it removed. And that boundary still exists. You can still stand in places where second-growth trees rise around massive decaying stumps, where something smaller has grown in the shadow of something that no longer exists. At first glance, it looks like recovery, like the forest is returning, but if you look closer, the scale is different, the structure is different, and the system is not the same. Which brings us back to the part of the story that never gets resolved, because we still don't know what those forests were fully doing while they were intact. We can describe fragments, we can model certain behaviors, but we never observed the complete system in operation. It was removed before we had the language, the tools, or the awareness to understand it as a whole, and that creates a very specific kind of silence, not the absence of information, but the absence of questions. Because once something disappears, before it is understood, it becomes difficult to even frame what was lost. You don't just lose the system, you lose the reference point that would allow you to recognize it again. That's why this story doesn't end with the trees. It extends into the present, into the systems we still rely on, into the way we define value and make decisions about what stays and what gets removed. Because if the same structure still exists, the same limitations in what can be seen and measured, then the pattern doesn't stop, it continues. And that leads to the hardest question in this entire story. Not what was lost, but what is currently being processed the same way, something large, complex, and not fully understood being reduced into parts before anyone has the chance to recognize what it actually is. Because if that's happening, it won't look dramatic. It will look normal. It will look like progress. It will look like something that makes sense right up until the moment it's gone, and all that remains is evidence that something much larger was there before. And that's the point where you have to decide how you're going to look at this. As history, something finished, something that happened once and won't repeat. Or as a pattern, something that continues to operate in the background, shaping outcomes in ways that are easy to miss until they're impossible to reverse. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And if this kind of perspective resonates with you, if you want to go deeper into the patterns, the missing pieces, and the parts of history that don't quite fit the official narrative, then make sure you're following this channel. This is Tartaria Revealed, where we don't just look at what's written, we look at what doesn't line up, what's been overlooked, and what might still be hidden in plain sight. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't the ones that were told, they're the ones that were never fully understood.